Today's guest is a lawyer who sadly Melburnians first became familiar with after his daughter Courtney was brutally murdered in 2019. Today, he fights for justice and judicial reform in the hopes that no other parent has to live through the nightmare he and his family have endured. Most recently, John Herron was one of the people to speak at the Justice Inquiry, and he's joining me now to share his thoughts on the final report. John, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and speak with me. First of all, I'm so sorry that you have to constantly relive this terrible moment in your life and your family's lives, but I appreciate that you're fighting for justice and for reform. So the inquiry that took place, there were 170 submissions and 8 days of hearings. Now that the final report has been tabled, what are your thoughts about the final report and the inquiry itself?
So in Victoria, when you talk about justice, that's anything but justice. That's how it operates here. So the report was, shall we say, doctored and determined from the beginning that it would have very limited outcomes. Any outcomes or recommendations that were put in, we're at a democratic state in Victoria where initiatives are put forward, recommendations in the justice field, can even be things like infrastructure. They're determined now, like never to be completed. So the outcomes are completely meaningless, and it was an exercise. There's a bit of debate how much it costs. They allocated $7.5 million for it. It might have been $2 or $3 million spent on the inquiry, but it occupied a lot of people's times, and that was it.
Did you feel heard during the inquiry?
So I'll start with the beginning with the terms of reference for the inquiry, because I had discussions with Tanya Maxwell from the Justice Party that had been the initiator of the inquiry. And at first I was a little bit annoyed. I said to her, why are these weak terms of reference? And she said, well, the only way she could get it past the Andrews regime would be to make it about a topic that they'd be comfortable with, which was recidivism. So it wasn't, as Fiona Patten said, like a broad-based and captured justice from top to bottom. And B, it certainly wasn't a forum where victims could be heard. So basically what happened is that the submissions that were made were fairly general, but they were heavily skewed to recidivism. And it's not a bad subject. I think it's good to discuss that. They should have made it an inquiry into, the outcomes of prisoners and recidivism. But that's another smoke and mirrors thing to call it the justice inquiry. So that's why it had this broad, shall we say, title. And then the other thing too is that Fiona Patten limited the types of, probably how this works in Victoria, it's like a bit of a group think. So you're pressurised into doing what the Andrews government would want, and if you don't, it's see you later. So it's as simple as that. So with that in mind, the people that appeared before it were quite selected. I was one of a few, but I only put that down to because I have a fairly high profile in this space. A lot of victims that are strong advocates in this area, particularly survivors and victims of sexual assault, never got asked to appear before the inquiry, and they wondered why. So that was that. So that was very much skewed towards, shall we say, activists in related spaces like prison reform. So that way you could easily doctor the outcome, because if you had to write the report, you could only go on the material that was before you, and therefore tick a box there, we've done it. And overall, the inquiry is to tick a box, because it's with the Andrews regime, they're very, very conscious of law and reform, because it's been a complete disaster and it gets worse every year. A watershed in this space is the murder of Jill Meagher in 2014. We had 30,000 people march down Sydney Road in Brunswick. So people expected reform. The Baillieu government at the time tightened bail laws, etc. But I know personally, having a suit against the government and seeing the information they released to me, that the range of offenders and offences is just escalate. So that's the result.
Somebody that works in the political space once said to me when I was having a conversation with them about another inquiry. He said, the government will never hold an inquiry where they don't already know the outcome of that inquiry. In your dealing with this whole process, would you say that's a fair statement?
Without adding further, 100%. So it was a predetermined outcome and an exercise to say that, yes, we have had a look at the justice system, and then move on. It's that simple.
You have spoken out on a current affair in a story that was aired last week, that you're concerned that others could die if parole and bail laws were watered down. Fiona Patten, who is the leader of the Reason Party and who was the committee chair for the inquiry, was asked during the same story whether she was concerned that more lives, particularly that of women, could be lost. And Ms. Patten said that it was a conundrum. Now, as a father who lost his daughter to someone who was released from prison 4 months early after serving only a few months of his sentence for another violent crime against another woman, he was known to have an ice addiction. He had no fixed address when he was released, and there was no psychiatric report tabled when there was the hearing about his release. It leads me to two questions. How much more could the laws be watered down? And is that a conundrum, or is that a question that Fiona Patten should be able to answer after conducting this inquiry?
If you work for I've worked in the Department of Justice for a decade, and I deal inside and out as a lawyer. So when you ask about what more could be done, etc., it's a question that the inquiry touched on, which was when we talk about recidivism. So. And then the early parole. So, and I've again found this out in taking the government to the Supreme Court. So, and I knew this for a fact anyway. The simple fact is with my daughter that the killer was let out early. Now, his original sentence, which in any other state, there was an extremely violent attack against a woman. He would have killed her if she hadn't gouged his eyes and escaped. So he had a 10-month sentence for that up front. Right, so it would be several years, and now in the United States he wouldn't have seen the light of day. Now I saw his rap sheet, and it extended to 2 other states, and that was the ones that he got in. But his instance probably a little bit different because his parents had enough money to keep throwing legal fees and getting some legal representation. We'll just park that fact for the moment. But what you found there is extremely light sentence first up. So if you've going to have some sort of presumption of bail, like he wouldn't have even done any time, right? Fiona Patten said something like automatic bail for a sentence under 5 years. Well, manslaughter is under 5 years. Thanks very much. But at the end of that, he was released early and my daughter was dead. It's that simple. Now, that has been multiplied in the state of Victoria into double figures the last few years. Right? A lot of families come to me for help because they've got nowhere to go. And all of a sudden, when you find out that you're a victim, that what they find out is the state's against them. So first of all, there's the feeling that it's all about the perpetrator and not about the victim. That's a fact. The second part of that, then the state aggressively tries to silence them and push them aside. So there's a case example with Miriam Humker, who's missing a year ago, presumed dead. So I'm in court on Thursday defending her brother, that the police have taken to court for what you might call an apprehended violence order, primarily to keep him quiet. That's how the justice system works here on victims. These things that I mentioned, these are not one-off examples. So they're multiplied by dozens of times. People are absolutely bewildered. So there's many facets to this. So what is justice? So you can have if that's happened to you, nothing gets your loved one back. That's period, right? So people are consumed in the grief. It affects multiple members of your family, your community, numbering into the hundreds. And there's the ever-present feeling that you won't see your daughter again, ever. So what about the perpetrator? I noticed that I think it was Eurydice Dixon's father said, he hopes that the killer could find some type of so I won't call it, for want of a better term, like reinvent himself, but he gets a 25-year sentence. Okay, so there's that. Now, there's another group I talk about, not necessarily going off on a tangent, and that's where my daughter's killer's not guilty mental impairment. So they're in the Thomas Embling Psychiatric Hospital in Melbourne. The average time they do in there is 6 years. And I know many cases where they're out in 3, 2, and 1 years. They've committed horrible crimes, some of them multiple deaths. And these people have to understand that when someone dies in this position, it's not a quick outcome. I'll just be brutally frank with the facts. My daughter took about 3 minutes to die, right? If you can imagine that. So when I hear that it's all about letting these people out earlier, then people will die. It's just it's an axiomatic fact. Second part of that, what sort of treatment do they receive when they're inside and when they're released? So again, with my daughter's killer, as you said, he received no psychiatric assistance evaluation when he was inside. Nothing to do with his he has a very Henry Hammond, a very high propensity to attack exclusively women, which many of these perpetrators actually do. They picked on the weaker gender. That's their MO. So you get no treatment or recognition, no remorse, no understanding of the gravity and severity of your crime, no appreciation of the victim or the impacts on them. So you whack all that together, and then you're all about, and this is summarising it, you're all about letting them out earlier, then you're going to have more deaths.
Let's go back to the people that have very similar sort of stories to yours and Courtney's. Henry Hammond was the perpetrator that murdered Courtney. Adrian Bailey attacked Jill Maher, and then there's Sean Price. They're all men that had very violent criminal histories against women. They were all out on bail or parole. Has anyone ever given you answers as to why the Victorian justice system keeps making the same mistakes over and over again?
No, in Victoria, which I think I said earlier, I liken it to how it operates, the Mexican political system with the PRI. So you've got it stacked from top to bottom. So the Labor Party operates in the same way, and it is political like this. Has anyone ever explained anything? No. Has anyone ever offered an apology or anything like that? No. Has the government put their foot down on my throat? Yes. I mentioned I work for the Department of Justice. So the only way I could get answers was to issue a writ of negligence. So this is how it works with the Andrews regime. An hour after that was announced publicly, I was given my marching orders. So I was told not to come back to the office. A sympathetic friend collected my daughter's photographs and put it in a garbage bag and gave it to me outside. So that is the extent that when you say, what would the Andrews regime explain to you? It's if you're in my position, the public wouldn't know that, and you wouldn't know this, Natalie, but that's how they operate. And people come to me weekly, used to be daily sometimes, with, please help me. I've got nowhere to go, no one to talk to. I've got the victim support agencies there's no agency, but the arms of the police, and particularly the Office of Public Prosecution, they're all there with their own agenda and their careers. As far as, to use a millennial term, care factor zero if you're a victim in Victoria.
So that brings me to one of the things in the report, which I did agree with, that there were strong recommendations about how to support victims of crime. And you've talked in previous interviews about how your family needed grief counselling through this whole process. And when you reached out for help, you were told to call the men's helpline.
That's right.
The recommendations that were made in this report regarding the level of support that victims of crime need and should be offered, does that give you some sort of hope that something good can come out of this inquiry?
No, because the Andrews regime now, they've got to the stage where they will make announcements of, if you want to talk about this space in victim support, and they have no intention of ever enacting them. So when there was a lot of outcry from, and it's all political and poll driven. So exactly a year ago, there was the state government budget, and they announced a raft of $500 million worth of extra funding for victims of crime. One of them was to reform the Victims of Crime Tribunal and Assistance, right? So fast forward to a year, where have we got to there? Zero, right? So that's one example that there was a lot of hype, a lot of press announcements about this. The media picked it up. They asked for what happens there with the regime is that they turn around the media, say, oh, what about X and Y initiative that you're touting? It could be anything from court funding, victims, as I said, tribunal system reform, and what happens? Nothing. So then we have an inquiry a year later, and they have the same recommendations. And if I take to the bank a year later, if you see what would be implemented, zero. So it's just another exercise. In the meantime, people are suffering and dying. That's at the ground level.
The final report was over 800 pages, and throughout the report, there is a very strong focus on those who are being caught up in the system, who maybe shouldn't, who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, that may do better with assistance and support rather than incarceration. Women were a particular focus because the number of incarcerated women is growing, same with Aboriginal people. So any human would, I imagine, recognize that there are people that slip through the cracks, that maybe end up within the criminal justice system that shouldn't be there. But is it possible that by watering down certain laws and boundaries for these people who are falling through the cracks, that it just leaves everything wide open for those who should be dealt with under the full extent of the law?
Yeah, that's right. So if you work in the criminal court like I do, the number one overriding factor of people that go through the system is poverty. Mm-hmm. It transcends any type of race, religion, whatever it may be, issues. And that's the main effect on them. So, of all of the murders of women you mentioned, it was only Courtney's killer that, well, although he was homeless and had no money, that's a fact, the rest of them had very tragic upbringings. There's no doubt about that. So how do you, the question is, if that's the case, again, I'll come back to what's offered to them. Okay, so inside prison, I'll give you an example. So drug and alcohol counselling and counselling per se is actually voluntary. So I remember doing some triage work on this a few years ago, and a lot of them had lower than 50% attendance. So they talk about slipping through the cracks. So that's going to happen there. But the other thing, the same thing with Courtney's killer, that when he got out, he told corrections before he got released he was going to go off the grid. So they knew that. So he got out and just vanished. Now, looking at a lot of their documents, and they're asking why, apparently a flag doesn't go up unless they're not heard for them in 3 to 5 months, right? So you've had some violent attacker like a Sean Price or an Adrian Bailey, you've just given them 3 to 5 months to go and do what they want before they get, eventually they're picked up only because they've attacked someone, right? So it is, I'm totally for a lot of these people to give them a chance, but to give them the tools to be able to bring themselves out of this. But when you're thrown out in the street, so one of the things that my daughter's killer was released to no fixed address, which is like, people can't believe that. But I found out in looking at documentation, corrections said there at that time there was 250 of them released to no fixed address. Now, another thing, if you want to know about that, the pandemic in Victoria, where you had to be mandated to be double jabbed, right? The homeless couldn't find a place in a youth hostel or a hostel anywhere. So they had to live on committed heinous crimes out on the street. When you go to no fixed address, you don't know where they are, right? You can't track them. They have no phone. They do whatever they want, take whatever drug they want. This is common and repeated over and over again until they actually commit a crime against someone, usually a woman, right? So it's nonsensical to think that, we want to address these things. People fall through the cracks and we want to let them out earlier to give them a better chance, but you don't give them a chance when Nothing's provided for them. The Corrections Victoria is a complete disaster, like the rest of the Andrews regime and the justice system. It's run by personalities, and these personalities and the executives are stacked top to bottom with political operatives, most of the time with absolutely zero experience. The Department of Justice was a political appointee, was an advisor to a Labor politician. No training, nothing. That's like 3 years ago. The next thing, she's running the justice system. So obviously, when you put in, that's just one example, but the same with the Victims of Crime Commissioner. It's rumoured that she must download videos all day because there's nothing else she can do. And she tells you that she can't investigate individual crimes. And all the victims that come against these organisations are completely frustrated. So again, this inquiry is about perpetrators, right? It paid lip service that victims are considered. Victims got no joy or consideration, if they can in life, from the findings of this inquiry. Again, it's another bitter pill that it's a political stunt, that it has no intention of doing to even one individual prisoner to try and rehabilitate them and put them on the straight and narrow. Everybody walked out of that inquiry, some of them probably richer, some of them probably being promised or implied that their political stakes are looking up. And that's that. People then go back to their lives and have to cope with what's happened from the disastrous Victorian justice system.
It did seem through the... Sorry, please continue.
Digest.
It is.
No, there's a lot to digest, what I say.
And it seemed there was a large focus on those who committed crimes and what was better for them rather than the victims, or the family of victims, or the wider community. Now, in the section that discussed mandatory sentences and how detrimental they can be for those who are in the system, Recommendation 67 talked about reviewing the Sentencing Act, which is all about mandatory sentencing, followed by Recommendation 68 that the Victorian Government should investigate the introduction of presumption against short terms of imprisonment in favour of community-based sentences and home detention. And essentially, the report was saying any sentence under, I think it was 5 years, is considered a short sentence and can be more disruptive to the person's life who's doing prison, because it stops them from being able to have a job, keep a home, and all of those things. So this is why it would be better if they were out in the community and we had these different options available. But when I was reading about that, it reminded me of a time in Melbourne where there were home invasions almost every night. We would wake up the next day to the news about another violent home invasion that was being run by all these gangs, and no suburb was safe. Everybody was terrified. And it came out that a lot of these gangs were youth gangs because they were essentially getting a slap on the wrist. Nothing was happening. These people weren't going to jail. And this is why the crimes weren't stopping. And I remember back then the conversations that most Melburnians were having were, we need better sentencing for people that are committing these violent crimes. It needs to be a focus to keep the community safe. But when I'm thinking about that and the fact that they were getting a slap on the wrist, if any of those people did jail time under these recommendations that are in this report, they would essentially never even see the inside of a prison. So what's the answer to this, in your opinion?
Yeah, so there are certain mandatory sentencing. I think there should be more mandatory sentencing for these violent crimes. So as an example, let's say with Courtney's killer, so he's originally charged with recklessly causing injury, assault. So, as a criminal lawyer, when you've got the word reckless in there, that pops up as a 2-year sentence. So what happens is that his lawyers just whittled down and got rid of the word reckless, and that enabled him to get a lot softer sentence. Right? So often your viewers might say, well, I'm a lawyer and I actually do that. That's true. So as far as I'm allowed to do, there's mandatory sentencing, then I have to stop cold. So that's how it works. But if I've got a famous barrister like Robert Richter in Melbourne, this $20,000 a day barrister that got McGatto acquitted, and he defended Craig Thompson in one of the extraordinarily great defences you've ever seen in your life. And he's been involved in a few other cases. There was a murder case of an 18-year-old boy where he got the killer bail, home detention, after a gang murder of a young boy as literally a bystander, and the family, a Vietnamese family. And I will add at this stage, like a lot of non-English speaking parents, etc., suffer as victims, suffer much more at the hands of the authorities because they're an easy rollover, an easy target. So they're left bewildered. So what happened there is that in that brutal murder, so that was to release that guy on bail who's pending murder charges. So what happens frequently, in the kind of cases I get, people are bewildered. Another factor here is the Office of Public Prosecution usually won't pursue murder charges because they don't want to look bad, because they might lose. So it's about image for the organisation. The organisation is supposed to defend A, the community, and B, victims. So they're like long gone. Forget the community and victims. It's how I look on my career. So they don't prosecute those cases to the full extent. And then if you've got a good legal team, they'll manoeuvre around, like probably Richter did, and he said, "Oh, let's do 2 years for manslaughter," and they go, "Yes." Now, Current Affair was talking about that case prior to that, and saying, "Oh, this, we're such a bad." So this is the way it rolls. Sure enough, that's what happens. So you're going to have that person there that was able to stay home with their parents after killing someone, and then get a sentence for a couple of years, and they're out, fairly light sentence. That qualify. So how does that's the Chan family from Vietnam who lost their only child, only son, right? Often these people from non-English speaking backgrounds have come from places where there is very tight sentencing or worse. And they go, how can this operate like this in Australia? They're actually bewildered, right? And then the system rolls them. This is how it works for people. Then they're in a meat grinder of fake victim support. So all of a sudden, a few days after the crime, the police will say, "Yeah, we'll keep you informed." Then the police vanish, right? I had that in my case. Courtney's mum and I had to do the rounds of Melbourne, and we're still doing them, to find out exactly what happened. And we did. We're told nothing. We'd have meetings with the Office of Public Prosecutions. Police wouldn't turn up for a year, 18 months. We would only find facts in the actual trial of what happened. And that's me as a lawyer pushing buttons. That's how you treat it, right? That is the norm. People come to me not because they're well informed and they're cared for or shown genuine concern by the state. They come to me because they've been discarded. That's why I have to fight. They've got no one else that understands the system, which opens up another thing. The legal fraternity in Victoria, the way the regime operates is that I'd say to a lot of lawyers and barristers, I've got to do something about this. So I know I can't, because if I appear before X and Y judge, I'll get hammered if I speak out. Now, this is an incredible situation of how it operates in Victoria, right? People fully don't grasp it unless you've been in it yourself. So the only reason that lawyers spoke out recently, for the very first time, they spoke out against Andrew's pandemic emergency legislation. They finally found a voice and put letters in paper. But it's like again, it's like Venezuela. They only came out in force when they thought there was a number, like they had the numbers not to get individually persecuted. Other than that, all of them, everyone I spoke to had sympathy, but they had a limitation of what they could do because they thought the justice system would discriminate against them as a lawyer. So digest that.
It's a terrifying situation. And over here in the US, I've actually been fortunate enough to go into a maximum security prison out in Lancaster. The unit that I was on, these guys have worked very hard on bettering themselves. A lot of them had 3 or 4 degrees. They've gone through all the appropriate rehabilitation programs that were relevant to them, and they couldn't get into this particular program that I was there with. without having done all that work and proven that they have no gang ties or anything like that. And there was true remorse for the things that they had done. And I will say that speaking to some of these people who are in prison for life without the possibility of parole and what that entails and the crimes that they had committed, I walked out and thought, I do believe that people can reform. I do believe that people should be given another chance, but I'm talking about people who have served 20 years, 30 years, and who have worked so hard on themselves. And then having this conversation with you about what's going on in Victoria and the justice system there, it blows my mind. I can only imagine the pain that it must cause for the families if someone has been murdered like Courtney was, to have to relive this and fight and fight and fight versus having the support there that realistically you deserve and you need. I can't even wrap my head around it and how anybody is thinking that
it's
all
not
of
support.
that is a good idea.
It's actually the state, and I use the term treating on you like your throat. That's what they're like. It's not, you don't get any support. That's just out the window. People realise that quickly. Look, I lived in the US for 3 years, and I remember an incident once when I was moving house, and I was talking to the removalists, and I said, how much you get paid? They only got paid, as it is in the US, by the tips, right? So I said, why are you doing it? And they said, we're cons, we can't get a job. And as you know, in the US, they can't vote even, right? And the long sentences. I don't agree with that. And Australian society is a little bit different from the US. We don't actually believe in punishing people to that extent, particularly young people for misdemeanors and that. As a society, Australian society, we don't accept that. And that is the case. But we are about, particularly like as a lawyer, country town lawyer, I deal a lot with young people, right? So they might get caught spray painting, something like that. I'll work with the cops to get them on the straight and narrow and get diversions, things like that. And that's good. And the police are really good with that. So in America, you can have these mandatory, 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, small sentences. They can be inside 15, 20 years. Australian society doesn't cop that. I don't cop that. And working with police, the general police population, forget the leadership, if you want a better term. But the average police here is still represents society and are committed to helping people out, particularly young people. And they've got a good, balance with that, and that's great. But we don't cop all those things and the remorse side of things. But let's just again switch back to the prisoner when they're inside, having clients inside. I'm one of the few lawyers that'll go inside and see. If I have to see a prisoner on the weekend, I'll do it because it means a lot to them to even show up. So the thing with that is, I know what it's like inside, and I know the lack of help they get. They're just sort of twiddling their thumbs so they get out, literally. Right? That's all it is. The amount of what's offered to them is next to nothing. Some of the look, I'm sort of going a bit off topic. Some of the prison farms I've worked at are quite good. So one of them's out near Ballarat that I spent a bit of time with, and they're known as one of the best farms in the area. Right? And I think what I've seen in there is really good, and it turns turns out these prisoners, mind you, the main cohort of that prisoner are sex offenders and pedophiles, right? So you've got them, the committed. There's many facets of the system. If I go down to that area, so what is the public demand with people that have committed heinous crimes against children, right? So they want to see them locked up. But the reality of it is that those people generate a lot of offences. They might have hundreds. They don't usually do it to one or two children. They do it to a lot of them. These are confronting topics I think need to be discussed. So what happens is that police, they can do a plea, and the police prosecutors want to give them a sentence, but they might get a 2-year sentence. So they tie them down a bit with some extra bells and whistles to keep them in the prison farm for a while. But that's the cohort of that prison. That's about 70% of that prison. So if the community is happy to release them again, Sentencing Act, yes, that's fine. And it always, an act like that needs reform all of the time. It's not no question about that. But to what extent the Sentencing Act has evolved over sentencing for various crimes. And there are reasons to have mandatory sentencing for violent crimes like intentionally causing injury where you almost killed someone. And in the majority of cases, the victim has permanent, if not physical disabilities or injuries, but psychological injuries for the rest of their lives. And the justice system, let's just summarise it, churns them out, doesn't treat them, doesn't monitor them, and they're gone. And that's a good thing. I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise.
These are always my thoughts. I look at the American system and I don't agree with how tough some of these sentences are. There was one night I went in for a presentation and there was a discussion because there were people that hadn't been in as part of this program before. And so while the presentation was going on, somebody asked all the prisoners who were present to put their hands up for the different sort of crimes that they were in for, all the sort of sentences that they had. And a lot of them offended while they were still teenagers. And some of these crimes were horrific. Some of them really weren't that bad. And these men are serving life without the possibility of parole. And you take hope away from people and you lose 99% of the time any chance of them wanting to sort of put any effort in or doing better with their lives. Thankfully, as I stated earlier, the people on this particular unit had all chosen to work hard and change the trajectory of their lives, which is quite incredible. But I don't agree with that. But I look at what's happening in Melbourne and it just blows my mind at how lenient everything is. And then to read a report where it seems to be pushing for more leniency, knowing the history in Melbourne, especially against young women by violent men, I can't sort of fathom that either. And I feel that there's probably, while I don't think there's any perfect answer, I think there's a happy medium somewhere in the middle of these two extremes.
That's true. There's a happy medium, but that's not how it works here. How it works is a violent crime is committed and the regime goes into an automatic overdrive. How can we keep this quiet? Right? Now, to extend that, something you haven't spoken about is the amount of, and I was speaking to someone on the weekend about this, is suppression orders. So in Victoria, Victoria has 52% of suppression orders in Australia. So the amount of, and it's very heavily skewed to releasing prisoners early, and particularly prisoners from the psychiatric facility at Thomas Ambling. So the whole system is geared. And I was talking to someone last night, and they mentioned a judge's name, which I'm not allowed to mention, and he was called Mr. Suppression Order because he just whacked them on left, right, and centre. And I talk to journalists all the time that you can be in a hearing, and one particular journalist, it's a crime reporter, as soon as he's cited by the judge, there's a suppression order. So right now, as you speak, there's probably half a dozen murders that have happened, ostensibly of young women, that we will never know about because they've got suppression orders. I've seen them. I've seen the orders. Of course, I can't talk about them. And the same with in Courtney's case, the first thing that happened was the narrative that she was supposedly living in the park. She was living with a boyfriend. And then it was only again through the media, and we had CCTV footage released of her shouting because she felt sorry for a killer and he was homeless. She shouted him a meal in a swanky restaurant in Fitzroy. So when I said to the police, why did you put that thing out that she was homeless? And I had the dumb look like, so it was all about the homicide squad putting out a narrative saying, the woman was living in a park and another homeless man killed her, let's move on, right? Now I'll use the operative term, let's move on, right? Because the one thing that the Justice Inquiry doesn't want to touch on, and there's certainly Andrew's regime doesn't want to touch on, the killing of young women in Melbourne is just escalating. Okay, so nothing's working now. If you're going to give that, and you're going to give it a push now and assistance, so more will happen. So the only response to that is, okay, the number one response, as I said, is to keep it quiet, keep it out of the papers. If we can suppress it, that's fine. If if on parole or bail, we'll suppress that. And then the second thing, well, let's have a Justice Inquiry to say we've had a look at it. Let's move on. So the whole game here in Victoria is to move on. And in the meantime, people are dying.
Will you be notified when Courtney's killer is released from the hospital?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it's another thing that understanding how the psych hospital is from my previous engagement there, but also I talk to people that work there as well. Neither myself nor the police are notified. Talking to the homicide squad one time, because they're quite frustrated. They build these briefs up to catch these killers and then they're just let out. So one of the homicide squad detectives was telling me that all of a sudden he got a call from a casino in Queensland and said, "Oh, we've got someone causing trouble up here. We thought he was inside. He just killed 2 people like 3 years ago." and how come? Because, well, I don't know, because we're not notified. I talked to the family, the Camerata family that were victims of Jonathan Dick, what we call in Victoria, the samurai sword killer who lopped off his brother's head in a shopping centre, and he attacked the Camerata family. Now, they've been the same treatment meted out to them. They're very, very, and I don't want to talk about the situation because who knows, the killer is probably, he's in the psych hospital, could be watching this program, as they do. They're allowed media access, they're allowed mobile phones, etc., etc. So one of the things the police put in, I listened to it, they said, "Oh, the police assured us we would put this and that in place." And I said, yeah, if you think about it, that is after he's committed a crime. So A, the police and you don't know when he's released, and B, they'll put in all these orders and things after he's had a go at you or hypothetically committed a violent act against you. That's the extent of it. Right? So as far as the long-winded answer, are we notified? The answer is absolutely not. I'll give you more examples if you want of that, but there's many. These are not isolated.
That, I think, is what's so scary as a woman and part of the general public. And I have 3 sisters, and we're all very strong, independent women and we live our lives. But I mean, that's a terrifying thought that these men who are committing these violent crimes are just so easily being released back onto the streets.
That's right. So you don't know that. I know that because I've seen it in the system. And I had an odd discussion with, not an odd discussion, it was a very sympathetic Tanya Plebisek that I talked to outside Parliament House a month ago, and she mentioned something about, talking generally about women in Parliament and then safety. And she goes, "Yes, according to Parliament, yes, I can operate no problems as a woman in there, but when I'm outside, I've got to look over my shoulder because I'm scared, right? And I can assure you, if you really knew what was out there on the streets of Melbourne and Victoria, you'd be very scared, right?" And I tried to instill that with Courtney when she was, as a young teenager, trying to restrict the movements of teenage girls. I don't know whether you can agree with me, Natalie. It's very difficult. And most of my grey hair now is due to Courtney was a bit of a rebellious nature, but they don't understand, they don't appreciate what's out there.
No, I think most teenagers feel invincible.
Yeah. There's a risk-taking factor, which probably genetically ingrained in us, and that's the case. But still, we shouldn't have a society where we facilitate what happens to Courtney and all of the dozens and dozens of other young women only over the last few years. Like, why I was in Canberra was to help Dan Spain, and they created a thing called the Silent Petition, the names of 900 women and children killed by gendered violence since 2009. When we were in Canberra, she added 5 names there. All right, so it's, you can look at statistics. If you look at statistics and throw them around, like certainly Australia is not a violent society compared to, say, the US and I remember in criminal law studying homicide rates, etc. It doesn't have that. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, but still, when you've got a disproportionately number of young women that are killed, and then on the majority of these killers are actually known to the women, just to clarify that, and like the unknown killers are a more distant third, But look, that opens up the door to domestic violence deaths, where there's been no dent into that whatsoever. And you spoke to me earlier about an emphasis of domestic violence in the report. Well, that would have to be standard to please the authorities then. But when you're really campaigning for domestic violence and I operate at the high end with violent criminals, and that's of great concern to young people. Men do not understand the fear that women have of these violent men. Am I wrong in saying that to you, Natalie?
No, you're absolutely not. So you've saved me from asking the last question, but we're going to go down this road, in that the focus in the report on domestic violence actually gave me a little bit of hope, and I'm curious as to your thoughts. In terms of educating police so that they can better deal with situations when they're called to these domestic violent situations, and where often the women are accused of being the perpetrator when they're in fact the victim. I have written articles that have been published in Australia and the UK on the relationship that I was in, where there was severe domestic violence. This man beat the living daylights out of me. And there's so much and so many layers to domestic violence. And many years later, something came up. Somebody reached out to me and said, I know what he did to you. I know that the holes in the hallway of the house are from where he threw you through those walls. Can you help me? I've been hospitalized. I have fractured ribs. This is what's going on. And I said, sure. And I went and spoke to the police officer who was dealing with her case. He said, you can't get involved. It's been too long. And I was actually quite relieved that I didn't have to step back into this. And then when the police officer said to me, can you tell me what happened? I said, absolutely. And I gave him the story. And I even explained that when I was getting out, I called a police officer who was a friend. And I told him what happened. And I said, what do I do? Do I press charges? Do I do this? This individual that did this to me had access to guns. We had guns in the house. And these aren't shotguns. These were handguns. And they were, the ones that I knew about were all legally owned. And the friend of mine had told me, as a police officer, you need to call and you need to make a report, and this is what will happen. And he explained the process. And he said, the police officer that gets the call and takes the case, he's the officer that you'll deal with all the way through, which will most likely be a constable. And then he said, as your friend, don't report it, because nothing will happen other than you will anger him. And he said, so what I'm going to tell you to do is get out as safely as you can, as quickly as you can, without creating any sort of drama or anything like that. And that was the move that I sort of made. And so I went through it all, spoke to this police officer in regards to this other woman's case. And I don't know this other woman's story other than that she'd been hospitalized. And the police officer said to me at the end of it, I've met him. And I said, okay. And then I realized what he was telling me. And I said, oh, you think he's charming? And he said, yes. And I said, you do understand they don't hit us on the first day. Like, it's a process. And there was no understanding. There was no, I didn't need sympathy, but empathy, or just an understanding of how this whole thing unfolds. And there just wasn't any of that. But we keep hearing from the government whenever there is a high profile case where there is family violence that ends in murder. The question is always asked, how does it get to this? And in my opinion, and I'm curious as to what you think after working in the system and dealing with these cases, is that when these men first start being violent towards their partners or the women in their household, the police don't take it seriously. Nothing has happened. They won't even take a report so that it's sitting on this person's file, so that by the time somebody is killed, they say it came out of nowhere. And that's not how it happens. Is that your experience?
It's my daily experience in operating a law practice and helping people out. Exactly like I could, when you first come in detailing the horrific things that have happened to you, I could have told you the script down pat. And so I say that all the time. There's a few little, so there's a recommendation that's a good thing. There's no doubt about that the police know that training. So I'll just give you, like, the murder of Celeste Manor in Melbourne 18 months ago, where a mirror thing happened. Then I talked to the family and provide counselling to them. So in that instance there, that they had a very heavy stalker with bad intentions. So they go to the police station, told to go home and block them on Facebook. Then they turn around and go to the court. That makes him angry. He breaks in, he stabs her to death. Okay. So I said, look, what I do, I actually go with the women to the police station and force them to put personal safety intervention orders, because they often, I'm very big on this, what you call counter IVO. So if you've got a wily domestic violence perpetrator, they'll generate their own report. Then you get into the Victorian groupthink about, or risk, we'll call it a risk management thing. So the police and the magistrates, they get two stories. So what happens there is that they weigh up the pathway where they will personally get into the least trouble, right? So, and another thing too is the volume. So about 75% of these IVOs or AVOs are what you call backyard disputes. Magistrates are very frustrated with it. They're so overwhelmed that they can't look at all the material in front of them, and they've got to make judgments quickly, and they sort of take an each way bet on it, right? But that each way bet results in people dying. It's as simple as that. So I just have to personally intervene with people in your situation when that happens. So do I trust the police to do that? I could just sit here all day and tell you about, no, but it's not necessarily their fault. Sure, they could do better training. They know what's happened, but they have to follow this procedure. And then again, when you're operating in a regime like Victoria, what happens is this groupthink comes in, right? If I buck the system or take a stand and stick up for this woman, I'll be in trouble, right? That's how it operates. So it's not I should do the right thing and protect this woman. It's, if I go out on a limb and the guy's powerful, or another factor too, which I always rail on about, the first thing I ask women that are suffering these things, is there a police member on the other side or an extended family member of that? Because if you of the police, if the answer is yes, you've got trouble. You won't get an order on you or whatnot. And you can have police cars driving past your house. That's how it operates here, right? So getting back to in many cases they do step in and they're really good, but they do need some training. But the whole thing here, well, they're all band-aids. Unless the regime in Victoria is removed and you can have a reset and recalibration of the individuals that run the system, then nothing will change, right? So putting on recommendations here, there and everywhere, which makes sense, which that does, how is that to be implemented? Because we're here now in 2022. This has been going on. Jill Maher's death was 2014. So what have you had in those 8 years? Really, what has transpired? We've spent in Victoria $5 billion on domestic violence initiatives. $5 billion, right? Now, if you're in my position, you try and get a woman placed in a safe house refuge, and you ring around and they're closed, and they say come back after hours. When if you know the situations, they mostly occur at night, and I could go on and on and on about that there's almost nowhere to go. But if you ask the politicians, it's, we gave $20 million to so-and-so shed down the road, which is actually staffed by people in my party, that type of thing. We are here because we're here because of these things. If these things wouldn't be occurring or escalating as they are, unless all of these recommendations over 8 years, including a Royal Commission, had been enacted. Where are they? Where's the money spent? I know where the money's gone. The money's gone on cronies and jobs, right? There's probably 25, 30 people that supposedly have run Domestic Violence Victoria, and they've been able to secure a $500,000 job at Department of Justice or somewhere else out of that. But in the meantime, I just keep coming back to the same thing. Women are dying.
The other thing that I discovered when I first started speaking about my situation was that almost every woman in my life, because I didn't talk about it until it was over, and I was out of that because I was so embarrassed and I felt so completely alone. And when I started speaking, I think 95% of the women in my life all started to share their own stories. So this is not a one-off thing. It's not a rare occurrence. This is happening all the time. And I think these men continue and escalate just because there aren't any repercussions for their actions. I will just finish up by saying the girl that I referenced that was hospitalized with broken ribs from the same person that had abused me, I reached out to her because we weren't close friends or anything like that, and there wasn't any sort of vendetta, but I reached out to her because I hadn't heard anything, and I said, how's the case going? And she said, oh, I haven't heard anything. And I knew at that moment that nothing was going to come of it. And a week later, she messaged me and said, they've dropped the case citing not enough violence. The woman was hospitalized with fractured ribs and handprints all over her body, and they said there wasn't enough evidence. So
my phone is going off next to me with women of similar stories.
yeah.
I see it all the time. Certainly the incidents that you've reported, absolutely. The amount of sexual assaults is vastly underreported. That, as you said, women are quiet about it. Domestic violence as well. You mentioned like what sort of resonates with people is the physical violence, right? But domestic violence is probably taken a different turn, and the coercive control, the financial abuse of women, it destroys them, really. So that's just out of control, right? Literally out of control. And those things need to be reined in as well. Like to sliver out coercive control, the UK has done some really good, and Canada's done some good work in criminalising that issue. And that does have an effect. But to pick up your thing about these men, a lot of these men know the system and they work through it. Absolutely, they do. You know, Rose Batty's husband was a master of doing that, which ended up killing his son as an example. So they absolutely do. I'd see it all the time. But they should be locked. I'm aghast alongside the women I'm representing, but I've got to push through for them. I make enemies of the police and whatnot, but I have to. Someone has to do something.
I will say the person that was in my life did not work for the police, but had very strong connections. And there was certain things that he did that set me up to make me look like I was crazy. And I think we'll have to have another conversation on the topic of domestic violence so that we can delve even deeper into it, because it's such a huge and deep conversation that I think needs to be had and needs to keep being had until there is change, so that there's awareness to remove the stigma and all of it, everything that's associated with that, to be able to actually affect some sort of change.
Yes.
Now, the thing that I wanted to finish up on, you're running in the federal election for the seat of McEwen. So I wanted to just find out how that was going for you.
It's let's say it's an exercise in experience in learning the ropes of politics. It doesn't necessarily engender me with any more confidence in the system, so to speak, politically in Australia. That's all I'll say. And if it's the state election that I'm more concerned about in so far as having an impact on law and order and domestic violence.
Well, I would like to thank you for continuing to fight for your daughter Courtney and for all of women across Victoria. It's wonderful to have such a strong man championing for all of us. So thank you so much for doing that and for your time today.
Thanks, Natalie.